one of the easiest ways to bond with your kids is to tell them stories about yourself. And this is not always easy because, in my opinion at least, the more personal the story and the more vulnerable you are in the story, the stronger the connection you're going to create between you and your kid. So I'll just give you an example of two stories that I've told them, ones that aren't so personal I don't mind sharing on the internet, although I've told them much more personal stories than this. We'll come back to that. So the first one being when I was a little kid, like 7, 8 years old maybe, my dad had a store, and across the street from the store was a appliance repair store. Okay, this place, it was kind of a junkyard though, because inside they did repairs, and then outside they had old broken appliances, including old refrigerators. So me, being a little kid, would wander out of my dad's store over to this place across the street, and I climbed inside of a refrigerator. It was one of those old refrigerators with the locking handle on it. When I got inside of it, not only did it fall over, but the door slammed shut and locked me inside. By far one of the most terrifying things I've ever experienced in my life as a little kid, suddenly being locked in the dark and realizing you can't push the door open. It was pretty scary. So I don't remember a whole lot else about that moment except being panicked, and then suddenly my dad opened the refrigerator and found me. I have no idea how long I was in there or how serious the situation was. Even as an adult looking back, I realized this could have turned out much worse, right? If my dad had been a little more distracted, didn't know where I was for a longer period of time, I could have suffocated inside of this sealed box. And but I didn't. He saved my life that day. So I told my kids this story, and they love hearing about it. You know, they love hearing about their dad being vulnerable, being a little kid, and potentially being in a life-threatening situation. But of course, I survived. There's another story that I tell them about, which came up again while we were playing a card game. And my oldest daughter, who has heard this story many times, they've all heard it. She said, well, I got to explain a little bit the situation. So we're playing this card game where you have to decide which situation is worse. And one of those cards says something about being bullied by someone. So I rated all the cards, and I gave the bully card, not too high a rating. Like, it was bad, but not terrible. And so while we're discussing why I made the choices I did, my oldest daughter says, well, yeah, it's like Dad would just slam him on his head. He won't, he's not afraid of bullies. And my younger daughter, she's like, well, what are you talking about? It's like, well, tell him the story, Dad. And so like everybody's wanting me to tell the story again. And that's the part that I want you to get. That's the meat of it, right? Like, you want them to be engaged with you, with what's happening, and they're interested in your life. You're meshing together, so to speak. So the story is this. It's actually not all that complicated. I was, again, elementary school age. I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I remember the school, so I know it was elementary school. They had this huge field out behind the school, and we were having field day. Very large open field. Imagine, probably 300 or 400 kids outside, a few adults watching over all of these events going on. And I am being followed around by this kid who is harassing me. Okay. So I'd be over near one event, I'd sit down, he'd come by and kick my chair, and he's leaning over me and putting his face all in mine. And this went on all day long. And at some point during the day, I won't say I snapped, but I just had enough. He was standing in front of me, he was leaning on, he was joking and laughing, and almost instantly, without even realizing it, I had picked this kid up, flipped him up upside down, and was holding him around the waist with his head pointed down towards the ground. And almost in slow motion, I could see myself body slamming this kid on the ground as if it was WWF wrestling. And he hit the ground, smack on his back, and I just looked at him. And I remember that vividly, that image of being shocked at myself. I'd never hit anyone before. I'd never been in a fight before. And this was the whole extent of the fight. He was making fun of me, standing in front of me, and then he was on the ground. So this is the story I told my kids, that how I was shocked that was in me and that I had done anything, and that was also the end of it. It wasn't like a big fight, and it was over. The part that I didn't tell them the first time, but that I ended up telling them later, was that same kid actually ended up becoming one of my best friends, and he was friends for as long as we both lived in that same neighborhood. It was years and years that we were friends after that. So it's amazing how you go from being in this weird situation with someone who suddenly became a good friend. But it's a story that my kids enjoy hearing, as short lived as it is, as medium the story is, in my opinion. They love hearing it and love thinking about it and talking about it. But the more important thing that I want you to get from that is how it bonded us, this opportunity to talk. And with the kids individually, not so much at the table, I've told them much more personal stories, things that were hurtful or painful experiences I've had in my life that I had to deal with. And I think things that they may have to deal with, things that are just too personal to talk about on the internet because, it's the internet. But one-on-one, I've talked to my oldest daughter and my oldest son about things that I've dealt with. And these were important moments for me to share with them, because if I can share with them, they can share with me. If you don't open that door and be vulnerable with them, tell them things that are extremely embarrassing to you, which was the case for one of these things that I told them about. Extremely embarrassing, but I told them, and that opened a door for us to talk about something that can be really uncomfortable. If you are willing to do that, you'll be surprised at the doors in conversation that it'll open for you. Not only will you have a better relationship with your kids, but they'll be able to tell you things that they otherwise couldn't tell you, because you've opened the door. But you have to be willing to expose yourself to get them to expose themselves. Anyway, go be a dad.